Contextual moderators of stereotype activation. Stereotype activation is not moderated solely by the contents of the perceiver's mind. Contextual factors also play a role in determining whether stereotypes are activated in the presence of social category members. For example, Castelli et al. 2004, Plant et al. 2005, Schaller et al. 2003. In particular, the situational context in which category members are encountered provides important input to the categorization process, as was demonstrated recently by Wittenbrink et al. 2001, Experiment 2. They used a sequential priming paradigm following Fazio et al. 1995, in which participants responded to black and white face primes that were accompanied by positive or negative background scenes, a church interior or a street corner, respectively. The results indicated that in the negative context, black face primes produced disproportionality facilitated responses to negative items, particularly negative stereotypic items. In the positive context, however, there was no evidence of a prejudiced valence bias, suggesting that activation of the negative black stereotype was attenuated by its presentation in a negative stereotype incongruent context. Work by Kurzban et al. 2001 also supports the role of contextual information in determining stereotype activation. Kurzban et al. Sought to challenge race as one of the big three in social categorization, Fiske 1998, and to demonstrate that the propensity of social perceivers to categorize according to race is a byproduct of the tendency for race and coalitional friend/enemy status to be correlated. Kurzban et al. Employed the category confusion paradigm, Taylor et al. 1979, asking participants to form impressions of a series of individuals through a set of materials, pairing faces of black and white individuals with opinions ostensibly expressed by the individuals. In one experiment, the expressed opinions provided cues to coalitions and suggested two allegiances within the set of individuals. In a surprise recall test, participants continued to make more within-race errors than between-race errors, demonstrating a lack of differentiation among blacks and suggesting categorization on the basis of race. However, the same participants also exhibited category confusions on the basis of coalition, albeit less strongly. In a follow-up experiment, physical cues to allegiance were added to the verbal cues. In this case, there was a reversal in the importance of race versus coalition categorization, such that race confusions decreased dramatically and coalition confusions increased just as dramatically. In another examination of how factors outside the perceiver affect stereotype activation, McRae et al. 2002b adopted a functionalist approach and speculated that the direction of the target's eye gaze would moderate stereotype activation. They reasoned that eye gaze acted as a cue through which perceivers could assess the relevance of the target, such that eye gaze directed toward the perceiver would be particularly relevant and would impel the perceiver to discern the intentions of the target. Importantly, assessing these intentions would be facilitated to the extent that any relevant information could be accessed, and categorical, that is, stereotypical, information could provide intention-relevant information. Indeed, their research demonstrated that gender categorization was faster for direct gaze faces than for faces with averted gaze or faces with closed eyes. Furthermore, lexical decisions were faster when gender stereotypical words were preceded by direct gaze faces than by laterally averted faces or faces with closed eyes, suggesting that gaze direction moderates both person categorization, and stereotype activation. Other evidence also supports the role of target characteristics. For example, Blair et al. 2002-2004, Hugenberg and Bodenhausen 2004, Locke et al. 2005, Maddox 2004, Maddox and Gray 2002. Categorization and stereotype activation. The case of multiply categorizable targets. But what of social categorization in the real world, where category labels are not provided by an experimenter, or where the target's identity reflects multiple category memberships upon encountering an individual? Perceivers must make their own categorization, a categorization that can take many forms depending on the behaviors or features to which the social perceiver attends. Stereotypes will not influence thought or action if they are not activated, and they will not be activated if the target's membership in a stereotyped group is not detected, as may be the case when the target belongs to several groups, for example, gender, ethnic, occupational, and so on. How does the mind deal with the problem of multiple category memberships? One possibility is that the target will be classified in all possible ways, and that each of the applicable stereotypes will be activated simultaneously. Perhaps then all of the stereotypes that happen to be associated with those various categorizations will be activated. And from this assortment of associations, the perceiver will attempt to produce a meaningful, coherent, and well-structured impression of the target. One recent model, Kunder and Thagard, 1996, suggests that these disparate categorizations, and indeed anything else that is known about the target, that is, individuating information, will be activated simultaneously and will mutually constrain each other's meanings, eventually converging on a summary impression that can best accommodate the various elements composing one's knowledge of the target. When perceivers encounter a multiply categorizable target, all applicable categories are believed to be activated in parallel, and a competition for mental dominance then ensues. Contextual salience, for example, Biernat and Vesio, 1993, chronic and temporary category accessibility, for example, Smith et al., 1996, comparative and normative fit, Oakes et al., 1991, and temporary goal states, example, Pendry and McCrae, 1996, are all factors that are likely to confer an activation advantage to particular categories in such a competition. This task could be daunting and counterproductive. However, almost inevitably, some elements of the available information will work against these goals of simplicity and coherence, either by conflicting with other information, for example, the nun known to have taken the vow of chastity, but who was observed to spend many hours reading racy romance novels, or by distracting the perceiver from whatever dominant themes might emerge in her impressions. For example, the nun who displayed behaviors consistent with kindness and charity, but who was also seen to perform an interpretive belly dance. In light of this, recent approaches assume that the process of information selection in impression formation involves not only the facilitation of some information, but also the inhibition of interfering or irrelevant information. In this variation of the parallel constraint satisfaction view, mutual constraint refers not only to the contextualization of an attribute's meaning given other known attributes, but also, under some circumstances, to the active inhibition of some attributes by others. That is, category selection is assumed to be facilitated through the implementation of basic inhibitory processes, such that potentially distracting categorizations are removing from the cognitive landscape through a process of spreading inhibition. The result is an impression that is coherent and straightforward. undiluted by distracting and complicating elements. Evidence for inhibitory processes in stereotype activation comes from McRae et al., 1995. See also Dunn and Spellman, 2003. The studies involved the video presentation of an Asian woman who could be categorized in two salient ways, that is, on the basis of sex or ethnicity. In one study, prior to viewing the video and judging its edit quality, participants underwent a parafoveal priming manipulation in which either the category woman, the category Chinese, or no category was activated. After viewing the video, participants performed an allegedly unrelated lexical decision task in which the critical trials included words that were stereotypical of either women or Asians. With the control condition as a baseline, the data showed evidence of both activation of the prime. Have I read that right? With the control condition as a baseline, the data showed evidence of both activation of the primed stereotype and inhibition of the non-primed stereotype. When the category woman had been primed, participants were both significantly faster to verify stereotypical associates of woman and significantly slower to verify stereotypical associates of Asian than controls. Conversely, when the category Chinese had been primed, participants were both significantly faster to verify stereotypic associates of Chinese and significantly slower to verify stereotypical associates of woman than controls. This basic pattern was replicated in a second experiment in which the salience of the particular categorization was manipulated with contextual cues rather than the parafoveal priming manipulation. For evidence against category dominance, see Stroessner, 1996, Weeks and Lupfer, 2004. Interestingly, perceivers as motivational states also seem to play an influential role in the active inhibition of competing social categories. For example, Kunde et al., 2002. In a provocative demonstration, Sinclair and Kunde, 1999, see also Kunde and Sinclair, 1999, demonstrated that after participants received favorable feedback from a Black doctor, associates of the category Black became significantly less accessible, while associates of the category doctor became significantly more accessible. In other words, when motivated to view the Black doctor as competent, participants inhibited the category Black and activated the category doctor. They did just the reverse, however, when the Black doctor provided negative feedback, and they were thus motivated to view him unfavorably, activating the category Black and inhibiting the category doctor. Interestingly, a final experiment demonstrated that the tendency to inhibit the Black stereotype following positive feedback was present only among high prejudice participants, who presumably had more reason than low prejudice participants to avoid thinking positively of Blacks. Motivational factors, therefore, appear to be as important in the inhibition as in the activation of stereotypes. Categorization processes in impression formation, stereotype application. Given the challenges of monitoring a multiplicity of information in the social environment, perceivers may need to be selective in allocating attention. In addition to the problem of allocating limited attentional resources to the range of environmental stimuli available, either in the context or in the multiply categorizable target herself, perceivers are also confronted with the task of disambiguating the stimuli to which they attend. Human behavior is often complex and ambiguous, and therefore open to multiple plausible interpretations. Stereotypical expectancies provide one way of selecting among competing interpretations and, in so doing, have a number of intriguing effects. Not surprisingly, when all one knows about an individual is that he or she belongs to a particular social category, the stereotype associated with that category can determine the perceiver's impression of that individual. Thus, a person described only by a male name may, when no other information is available, be viewed as more likely than a person described only by a female name to be categorized by a host of traits associated with masculinity. Heilman, 1984, Loxley et al., 1980. Students described by only their academic majors may be expected to behave differently in ways that are consistent with the stereotypes about their majors. Nisbet et al., 1981. Blacks portrayed only in photographs may be viewed as more superstitious, lazy, emotional, untidy, and immoral than whites portrayed in photographs. Secord et al., 1956. Stereotypes also appear to influence the perceiver's interpretation of behavior. For example, Cameron and Trope, 2004, Jones and Kaplan, 2003, Mars et al., 2005, Otaki et al., 2005. When a person known to belong to a particular social category performs an ambiguous behavior, the stereotype associated with that category influences the apparent meaning of the behavior. Thus, a shove may be viewed as more violent when performed by a black individual than by a white individual. Duncan, 1976. Sagar and Schofield, 1980. A mixed performance on an academic test may be considered better when performed by a child of a higher rather than lower socioeconomic background. Darley and Gross, 1983. And the behavior hit someone who annoyed him or her may be interpreted as punched an adult when performed by a construction worker, but as spanked a child when performed by a housewife. Kunda and Sherman Williams, 1993. More recently, D'Agostino, 2000, demonstrated that exposure to ambiguous sentences such as "some felt that the politician's statements were untrue" led participants later to manifest stereotypical, for example, politician lied, than non-stereotypical, politician erred, recall errors, suggesting that stereotypes had influenced the construal of the behaviors. Stereotypes also influence the meaning that a perceiver assigns to a particular trait. When a trait is used to describe a member of a stereotyped group, its meaning can be influenced by the group's stereotype. That is, the same trait can imply different behaviors when implied. That is, the same trait can imply different behaviors when applied to members of different groups. Kunda et al., 1995, found that perceivers rated lawyers and construction workers as equally aggressive, but nevertheless held very different expectations about their likely aggressive behaviors. Lawyers were viewed as more likely to argue and complain and less likely to punch and yell insults than were construction workers. Several studies suggest that the assimilative effects of stereotyping extend even to situations in which apparently irrelevant information is available to supplement category membership information. For example, Hilton and Fine, 1989, Kruger and Rothbart, 1988, Loxley et al., 1980, Raskinski et al., 1985. Darley and Gross, 1983, for example, demonstrated that a child was viewed as possessing better liberal arts skills, cognitive ability, and emotional maturity when she was viewed on a brief video in a context implying high, rather than low, socioeconomic background. Without the video evidence, however, these differential evaluations of the child did not emerge. Thus, ample evidence has accrued to demonstrate the effects of stereotypes on social judgment. For example, Biernat et al., 1991, Duncan, 1976, Kunda and Sherman Williams, 1993, Sagar and Schofield, 1980, Vallone et al., 1985. Similar outcomes have been observed in the context of jury decision-making. For example, Bodenhausen and Weyer, 1985, and job applicant evaluation studies, for example, Heilman, 1984. As in the case of stereotype activation, stereotype application effects are moderated by a host of cognitive variables. Some conditions that exacerbate the impact of stereotypical knowledge on judgment and memory include mental busyness. For example, McRae et al., 1993, Pendry and McRae, 1994, task complexity, for example, Bodenhaus and Lichtenstein, 1987, information overload, for example, Prato and Bach, 1991, Rothbard et al., 1978, time pressure, for example, Roglansky and Freund, 1983, and low levels of circadian arousal, Bodenhausen, 1990.
Smooth moderator.